And I'm Carola Frediani. I'm a journalist covering cybersecurity for La Stampa, and I had the pleasure to introduce the third session, Securing the Cyberspace for Business. So I'm inviting the speakers to join me on the stage. We have Mr. Edward Felten, Professor of Computer Science and Public Affairs at Princeton University. We have Rocco Mammoliti, Chief Information Security Officer at Poste Italiane. We have Adam Sedgwick, Technology Policy Advisor at the US Department of Commerce. Roberto Viola, Director General at DG Connect at the European Commission. And Shinichi Yokohama, Head of Cybersecurity Integration at NTT Corporation. As we have seen so far, the digitization of the world is a great opportunity, but there are still some challenges that need to be addressed. In the last year, we saw an exponential growth of security incidents, data breaches, and malware campaigns. Also, we saw the growth of the cybercrime business. Ransomware is a multi-million-dollar business, generating at least $25 million of revenue, according to some estimates. We also saw the growth of attacks based on the Internet of Things, using connected devices to target even DNS providers. And last but not least, there is the increased connectivity of production of smart machinery, the so-called fourth industrial revolution, where connected smart manufacturing raises the stakes. So, we are here to talk about what can be done in order to make internet more secure. Or maybe the correct question is what can be done to make data, users and organizations more secure. So I'm honored to give the floor to Mr. Edward Felten for his keynote speech about this. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be invited to speak today. Thanks for your time and attention, and I'll try not to be too frightening. There's an old story in the cybersecurity field, a story that's been replayed many times in one enterprise after another. The story goes like this. A company has been successful in its own field, producing well-made and popular products for many years. And then the company decides to make their product smart and connected. So they hire technology developers and they hire marketers to sell the product. Perhaps the first product fails, but the company learns from its experience and the second product succeeds. Customers like the new smart features and the company's managers are thrilled. And then happens the cybersecurity incident. After the incident, investigation shows that the company neglected to take some important precautions, that it underinvested in security, and that a few of the company's engineers had recognized the problem, but top executives had never learned of their concerns. The incident teaches the company an important lesson. Those of us who have been in the cybersecurity field for a long time will find this story familiar. I've heard it dozens of times, and I even had a student write a PhD thesis about different case studies of it. Of course, many organizations avoid these pitfalls, yet there are too many failures. What so many of these cautionary tales have in common is the failure of organizations to recognize that they had taken on serious cybersecurity responsibilities. One can almost hear the executives saying, "We're not a cybersecurity company. We're not a technology company. We're still in the same business as before." But whether you like it or not, when your products or systems are smart and connected, you are in the cybersecurity business. In some ways, our societies are like those executives. We're in the cybersecurity business whether we like it or not. And as the full implications of that fact are arriving, we must all take our responsibilities seriously. The rise of cybersecurity and privacy as concerns is fundamentally changing the nature of computing, which is my home field. Many of us are in this field because we're excited about technology's potential to improve human life, to create prosperity, to advance scientific and social discovery, to save lives, and to bring people closer together. Computing can do all of those things if we develop it wisely. For many years, the main factor limiting what computing could do was capacity, the number of calculations that we could do, or the amount of data that could be stored or transmitted. As the cost of capacity fell, the main limiting factor was no longer capacity, but now it was complexity. Computer systems are the most complex things ever devised by humanity, and that complexity was difficult for human programmers and managers to manage. Now we've entered a new era in which the main factors that limit computing and hold back its enormous potential to improve human lives are rooted in cybersecurity, privacy, and governance. So the cost of falling short on cybersecurity is not only the direct harm from a security breach, but also the opportunities we lose when we hold back progress because we do not have justified confidence that we can manage cybersecurity risks. Every sector has a role to play in solving this problem, and success depends on participation by all. Industry has an important role to play because industry builds the systems we rely on, as well as the tools that are used to build those systems. Government is the operator of systems, is involved in law enforcement and in policymaking. Civil society has an important role as a watchdog and a forum for discussion. And academia has an important role in hatching ideas and training the next generation of cybersecurity leaders, as well as the leaders in other fields who will need to address cybersecurity. We know that it's possible for enterprises to build and manage large systems and data sets responsibly, to manage and understand the risks, because some enterprises consistently meet this standard, and a few consistently exceed it. But we also know that failures are much too common. The main challenge for industry is to move all organizations closer to the standard that is met by the best companies. A practitioner whom I respect once told me that there are no solutions in cybersecurity, there is only hard work. What she meant is that technical success depends on maintaining the discipline and the investment needed to apply best practices at all times across all areas of activity, and to incorporate careful risk analysis into all decisions affecting cybersecurity, which means nowadays almost all decisions. Technical success relies as well on integrating cybersecurity into operations, rather than treating cybersecurity as a separate concern to be addressed by a separate team or organization. Just as an airline cannot have one team responsible for flying airplanes and a separate team responsible for avoiding crashes, but must instead make safety a joint responsibility of the entire organization. In the same way, an organization facing cybersecurity risk must make security a joint responsibility. The cybersecurity team can lead, but the work of cybersecurity must be shared by everyone. There are many codes of best practices to guide these efforts. In the United States, the NIST cybersecurity framework is a common reference point that has been adopted voluntarily by many organizations. There are many other frameworks. Frameworks, however, do not answer every practical or ethical question. Although frameworks are based on general ethical considerations that apply broadly, they cannot resolve the detailed ethical challenges faced in specific applications. Every organization and practitioner must be alert to these ethical considerations, and those of us in academia must be teaching our students how to put ethics into practice. For policymakers, the challenge is to make sure that the market can adequately reward those who are doing what's necessary in cybersecurity. The market by itself will not always do this. If companies and consumers can externalize the costs of poor practices, or if buyers lack the information to distinguish secure products from insecure ones, then the market will not fully reward secure practices, and the public will suffer. There are no easy solutions here either. In some sectors, such market failures can be addressed by regulation, but regulating cybersecurity can be difficult. Beyond the most basic precautions, cybersecurity practices depend greatly on context, and context varies across different sectors, products, and users. A one-size-fits-all regulation is difficult to find. Liability can be challenging as a policy tool as well, because of the difficulty of attributing causes and the complexity of products and supply chains that can frustrate attempts to find clear responsibility. Many of these challenges in technology and policy seem to depend on difficulties in getting information. That's why so many commentators call for more information sharing. Again, there are challenges. We're all happy to receive information from others, but we are often less happy to share our own information. We must be open to discussions about how to share more information for use in protecting cybersecurity, and also on how to assure data protection for the information that we do share. And information sharing cannot be a one-way street. Consumers also need information as much as large companies and government agencies do. Access to the right information can empower consumers and everyone to take positive steps and to make decisions to protect themselves. One of the important sources of information in this area is the research community. In the long run, we need much better technical options for preventing and managing cybersecurity risk. And the research community is working to develop these solutions. Some researchers are pursuing moonshots, ambitious efforts that aim to take a giant step forward all at once. But most of the benefit comes from taking many smaller steps, the accumulation of knowledge by a robust and international community of researchers. Some of the best ideas we have today were born in the research community, and we're going to need new tools from that community to confront the greater challenges of the future. I want to close by recalling a classic short essay, which is little remembered now, that was written in 1989 by the Dutch-American computer scientist Edsger Dijkstra. The essay, which is titled On Hygiene, Intellectual and Otherwise, tells a fictionalized story from history about the medical community's reaction to a proposal that surgical instruments should be sterilized in boiling water. The story works wonderfully as an allegory for how our communities can sometimes fail at the task of building a stronger and more sustainable technology infrastructure. In Dijkstra's story, some medical professionals reject sterilization because it's new. After all, boiling water has been known since the time of Hippocrates at least, and the heroes of the past did not boil their instruments, so why should we? Others recommend sterilization for student doctors, but reject it for experienced surgeons who are thought to know how to keep their instruments clean, making sterilization unnecessary. Still, other surgeons think that the task is below them. We're not dishwashers, we are healers. And others argue that medicine is a creative endeavor, and we must not control individual surgeons' work so as not to stifle innovation. Managers complain that sterilization is expensive, that it slows down time-critical procedures, and that workers might be injured by the boiling water. There are so many reasons to do nothing. The result in Dijkstra's story is that surgery is done unsafely, and patients suffer the consequences. Of course, the solution is not to ban surgery altogether, but instead to do it and do it safely, because the lives of patients depend on the need to do surgery as well as the need to do it safely. Dijkstra's story reminds us that it's easy to find excuses for not doing what needs to be done, and it's easy for each of us to find reasons to leave the difficult work to others. Like the medical professionals in Dijkstra's parable, we need only look around us to see the need for change in how we build and manage technical systems. There's room for all sectors to do more, and it's only through coordinated effort from all sectors that we can build a stronger framework so that we can realize the full potential of digital technology. Thanks, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Felten. Actually, you introduced some important topics of this panel, such as accountability and responsibility from companies, and also info sharing. I think we are going back to this. And also that there is no single solution, no magic solution to security. We know that, security is a process. From this respect, just a few days ago, the European Commission proposed a set of new tools, a cybersecurity package, including a European cybersecurity agency and a certification frameworks for tech products and services. So I think Roberto Viola, Director General at DG Connect, the European Commission, can talk about this and the recent European efforts to boost European cyber defenses.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Professor Felden for his really enlightening introduction. So, as you invited me, I'm going to delight you with what is the status of cybersecurity policy in Europe today. Oh, thank you very much. That's very useful. What is the status in Europe and what exactly we want to do in the new set of measures that you just introduced. I think I like to start from one consideration, Professor Felden. When you look at cybersecurity from the angle of policymakers, the most important task is to avoid what I call the two swimming pool type of environment. In a swimming pool, you have all that can swim and enjoy life, and in another one, with the water just like this, you have those that cannot swim. Of course, if there's an attack, the attack will go to the swimming pool of those that cannot swim. So the idea of those that can swim, that they should not learn to the others to swim, is wrong, because they actually exposing themselves and the whole community to a risk. So in Europe, the whole community, policymakers, agencies, research community, companies, have to learn to swim, and quickly. And to do that, information sharing is the essence. And of course, another dimension is that also the citizens have to learn quickly. That's why also the dimension that Professor Felden evoked, or cyber hygiene, is so important. You wash your hands, you know that this is good practice. The same applies in changing your password and being digital savvy when storing your important information. So it's the whole value chain, the whole system, the whole society that has to learn to cope with being secure when handling information. This is the essence of the European legislation. We have the basic legislation, which is the NIS directive, which is now being transposed in national legislation, that basically mandates cooperation among member states, mandates that each member state has a cybersecurity plan, and mandates that companies inform policymakers, regulators, if there's a cyber accident. So this is really the basic. Of course, this is a directive we proposed back in 2012, and the world has moved since. And also our ideas about how to tackle this have moved, and that's why 2 weeks ago we have complemented this legislation with a proposal which is composed by basically a number of things which we call package. So the package is, the main serving of this package is the European Cybersecurity Act, which in European legislation is a regulation, so when approved it will be directly applicable in all member states, which reinforces the existing cybersecurity agency which is called ENISA, and gives to this agency a permanent mandate, and introduces a voluntary certification framework. So these are the two key elements of the European Cybersecurity Act, and I will come to this in a second. Then, again, I thank Professor Felden for having mentioned this. We will now work at a network of competence centers in cybersecurity, and will establish a European Cybersecurity Competence Center. The idea is really to make sure that advanced ideas about how to tackle cyber risk is shared among our communities of researchers. And of course, this is not just for the sake of research, is to help businesses, to help governments to protect better their legitimate interests. And then we have also presented what we call in our slang a blueprint, which basically means a way to do things together, which basically organizes how the different actors should react in case of a crisis, a major attack that would involve more than one member state. Who should do what, by when, and how. Now, as I said, an important part of the European Cybersecurity Act is the so-called certification framework. Now, around the world, there are different words to say more or less the same. For us, a framework is a process of conformity to something. This something could be a standard, could be a set of standards. This process could be about measuring the conformity of people, processes, or products. It is intentionally open-ended in the Legislative Act, because this is, as I said, largely a voluntary exercise by companies, group of industries, by different constituencies. And of course, again, it was said, there's not a single size fits all here. I mean, it's so diverse to speak about cybersecurity problems in an electric grid compared to cybersecurity problems in aviation that you cannot have the magic wand and with a single legislation cover all this. So what the legislation does establishes what are the actors, public actors, private actors, it establishes what is the process. So basically, I mean, if a group of constituencies have the interest to have a framework in place for Europe, this can be done through the process that the European Cybersecurity Act identifies. So suppose you want to certify cybersecurity for autonomous cars, then you actually can propose this as a European certification scheme. You can actually get to the point that this is approved consensually by the Member States and the European Commission as a scheme. And then there will be private and public certification centers that would allow, I mean, to measure the conformity with this scheme. As I said, it would be wrong, and this is not our intention, to impose thousands of different schemes or ideas like this. So mainly we still expect that industry will come with their needs, and of course we have already concrete examples around Europe and the world of cyber security schemes. The idea is to avoid fragmentation. The idea is to avoid that a cybersecurity scheme which is certified, say, in Spain, needs again to go into the same process in Germany. So that's the whole idea. And of course, a little ambition also is once there's a European label of certification, this is a quality brand that can be recognized as a valid test throughout the world. So that's the idea around certification. And of course, what is in the kitchen, I mean, what will be, I mean, the essence are, of course, international standards. I think that's the right dimension for the problems we are dealing with. If a member state of the European Union or another nation state thinks to have its own proprietary standard and thinks to impose on the others, I think this is a very bad idea. I mean, most of the problems we are dealing with require the effort of the international community. So here you have a chart that explains how it works, and basically, as I said, it's a sort of bottom-up process. that then goes through the screening of our ENISA, so the Cybersecurity Agency. The Cybersecurity Agency prepares, the whole process for approval. Then it comes to us for final approval. A similar system we have in other sectors. For instance, drugs in Europe are allowed for circulation based more or less on the same approval chain, and it proved to be quite effective. So we don't decide which drugs are on the market. This is the pharmaceutical industry. But once they go into testing and they go into, let's say, the final stage of approval, the whole process is codified and people know what to expect. The same, we hope, it will apply to cyber security and cyber products. I don't know what they did. Okay, anyhow. The last point I want to make is again to come back on the competencies. Of course, this is not at all a bureaucratic exercise. This is not at all about filling forms. This is about helping our companies, helping the businesses to have citizens trusting the digital economy, trusting to exchange data, to use electronic money for transactions. So this means it is all about competencies. It is about understanding, and this competence needs to be shared. That's why we have proposed to create this network of competence centers which do exist in Europe, and to create a European center for competence in cyber. This center will be busy in moonshot projects, say quantum encryption, and also in day-to-day support to the business. So I hope, in conclusion, that what we have done in terms of proposals for legislation responds to the idea of sharing more, helping more the businesses, being light in terms of approach, but being effective at the same time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Viola. There is a policy effort actually to set up standards, guidelines, and frameworks to help a bottom-up transformation towards security. But how to build a culture also of responsibility within an organization. I think Adam Sedgwick, Technology Policy Advisor at the US Department of Commerce, can help us understand this aspect.
Thank you. Could I have the thanks? So thank you for having me today. I can help with that question, certainly. I guess one of the things that occurs to me when we think about cybersecurity is a quote that I saw the other day from President Eisenhower, former president of the U.S. And he said, if a problem cannot be solved, enlarge it. And I think with cybersecurity, that's largely what we've been going through over the past couple of years. Cybersecurity really started as a challenge that people thought resided in the server room, and increasingly with the rapid commercialization of information technology, as Ed has said in his keynote, it really requires much broader approaches, bringing in new disciplines and sorts of people to think about the problem and how to make progress. So my organization is the Department of Commerce. NIST is a part of the Department of Commerce. It's considered the technical arm of the Department of Commerce, and it's a measurement science agency focused on industrial needs. The way that we think about cybersecurity is that cybersecurity is about trust, right? Can technology be used for its intended purpose without undue risk? The reason why we view trust as important for industrial goals is because without trust, you'll have consumers reluctant to adopt new technologies. You'll have industry reluctant to invest in new infrastructure. And you'll have innovators reluctant to offer new ideas. So while I'm going to be talking about some of NIST's work, certainly when we think about the internet itself, we think about the work of my colleagues in NTIA, but also really across the department, we think about this as a growing need for industry. The way we think about our role is not just how do we help industry, but also how do we make sure that industry is still delivering for U.S. national priorities and delivering to its citizens. You know, for NIST, this is a challenge that goes back quite a ways. So NIST has been working in the field of cybersecurity for 40 years. Before it was called cybersecurity, even before it was called information security, back when it was just called computer security. And at the time, there was this great resource called encryption that had been largely developed for military purposes. And folks soon realized they would have broad commercial application. So as a result, they went to the National Bureau of Standards, which is the organization that became NIST. NIST still maintains that standard to this day, and I think importantly, it maintains it through international standards. So that root of trust that has done so much to deliver security for the internet, that is the same encryption that's being used in all of our devices, really is something that is an example of a multi-stakeholder process and one that's also international. The other thing I would say is a lot of my talk is going to be, or the discussion is going to be rooted in standards because that's where I come from. But you should also think about the interesting challenge that you have for people that think about measurement science that cybersecurity poses. A system that is 98% effective could lead to a devastating breach. So it really is something that we think about in terms of new ways to measure. I think the overall policy in the U.S. is really rooted in this concept of risk. The reason why we talk about risk management so much in cybersecurity is because we think it helps achieve that proper balance. It doesn't lead to security for security's sake. You are constantly thinking about the trade-offs. You know, a perfectly secure solution is one that would be perfectly inoperable. If you had no customers, if you had no clients, you could probably develop something that looks pretty good, but you wouldn't be working on delivering your underlying business mission. So this is actually a recent statement from President Trump's executive order, and it talks about cybersecurity in the context of maintaining the internet as a valuable resource. So I think that's an important policy statement that all of us in the U.S. adhere to. When it came time to think about cybersecurity, and Ed mentioned this a little bit in his presentation, the approach in the U.S. has been around something called the cybersecurity framework. And this came about as policymakers were trying to determine, given that there were numerous best practices, standards, and requirements, are there ways to reduce some of the complexity to make it easier for organizations to understand what those best practices were? And given that this is an approach that was impacting so many different sectors and so many different types of people in the organizations, how could we work together to begin to prioritize areas to work in and to communicate better concepts of cybersecurity risk? The approach that was taken then was to also have it be one that was primarily delivered by stakeholders. So beginning with a blank sheet of paper, we began asking questions. Where are the gaps? Where do we need to begin to identify those, fill those gaps? And then what are the next steps we should be taking? I think Ed mentioned the concept in this slide, which is that cybersecurity is a risk that needs to be considered throughout the entirety of an organization. So when we think of concepts of risk and what a cybersecurity program should have the objectives of, one is to support the mission and the business objectives. Two is to fulfill your cybersecurity objectives. And then the third one is to really manage vulnerability and threat associated with the technical environment. So you're not just thinking about the overall threat space, you're trying to understand how does technology support your mission and what is the cybersecurity threat of that. Organizations have really good concepts of risk in a lot of areas. They think quite a bit about financial risk or safety risk. So a lot of the work that we're doing is trying to bring the same sort of discipline to cybersecurity risk. When you're making those types of business decisions, when a product's going to go live, when you want to go into a new market, have you done that analysis to understand the consequences to your infrastructure and the new cybersecurity risks that could come as a result? And so here's an example of the approach we take in the cybersecurity framework. We look not just at risk management processes, but to what extent are they fully integrated? To what extent is the board of directors briefed on cybersecurity challenges? Is it something, there was an interesting McKinsey study a few years ago that indicated that a lot of organizations were paying a lot for cybersecurity but not getting a lot in return. Largely, I think they were trying to buy their way out of the problem. They knew it was a problem, they knew it was something that was difficult, so instead of building it into their enterprise, they hired the smartest people they could find to fix the problem, and then they never wanted to hear about it again. So there really is no buying your way out of the solution. People talk about the costs of cybersecurity, but there's also a way to have cybersecurity. Sorry, there's a bug. But there's also ways to think about cybersecurity. One of the other reasons we talk about risk is that risk assumes that you don't have unlimited resources. There's a reason why businesses don't have risk eliminators, they have risk managers. So as you build and grow that cybersecurity system, you're trying to understand the impact on your resources. And in many cases, having a smart cybersecurity program will make you more comfortable in making investments you need to deliver better services to your customers or to the U.S. or to your citizens. So these are all ways that we think about it. I mentioned learning from implementation as an important bullet there. One of the things that we've done with the cybersecurity framework is constantly put it back out for public comment. So that's also fundamental to our approach. Instead of just developing a methodology and leaving it as something that we think that will stand the test of time, we're also constantly engaging with stakeholders to understand what changes need to be made, how does the technology look different, how do business drivers look different. So NIST is actually in the midst now of doing that sort of update to understand additional things we should do. And because we baked the cybersecurity framework in the context of international standards, I did want to highlight that our use of framework is different than the EU definition of framework. While compliance is a component of this, we use the term framework to mean a collection of standards or best practices. And we have similar frameworks in healthcare and the smart grid environment. But I did want to emphasize that while this is a U.S. government approach, it really is baked in international standards. And as a result, it has that impact of being able to be used across country boundaries. In fact, we have adoption within Japan. We have wide use that Shinichi will talk about. We also have, of course, our friends in Italy have their own version of the cybersecurity framework that they have put out for comment and is now used. And we've also seen in the government in Israel. So in some ways, this approach is seen as a scalable approach because it is driven by stakeholders. And then we also have work in international standards organizations to provide that mirror image. And then with this foundation of these best practices and standards, we can begin to look at a range of other challenges that industry still has. So we talked a bit about conformity assessment. We highlight that and we work with stakeholders similar to how these standards are developed by industry. We also work with industry to understand how they would like to develop those strong conformity programs to understand how they're meeting the standards. And back to the idea of if you can't fix the problem, expand it. We also, now that we have this foundation developed over the past 4 years, we're able to develop with industry additional resources to expand upon the challenge. So cybersecurity, while it was this technical discipline, we can talk about it in terms of particular sectors like manufacturing. We have guides for particular regulatory requirements. And in the middle, we have something that's built on principles of quality management. And that's an interesting project because it actually tries to get away entirely from cybersecurity controls. So are there ways that we can talk about cybersecurity in terms of what makes an organization unique? How do you build a cybersecurity program based on your organization's vision? And how do you manage that program without thinking about some of the technical elements? And then I wanted to add on some other initiatives that we have in the U.S. that really are aimed at those broader cultural challenges. In the U.S., we have, like many other countries, negative unemployment in the cybersecurity field. So we have, based on several evaluations, we have more positions than are available, than we have people to fill those positions. So we have also been working in this area for the last few years, and we're going through an update now. Part of it is connecting not just the current workforce needs, but tracing it all the way back down to mapping where colleges and universities can provide that training, all the way through K through 12. So as we think about how to have these cultural aspects, part of it will be working throughout different stakeholder communities and building the pipeline of talent and people that when they show up to jobs and when they show up to Ed's class at Princeton, they have an understanding of what cybersecurity means and that they can eventually join the workforce of the future. And this is something that we are increasingly prioritizing in our international engagement as well. It's a problem that really transcends countries, and it's something that we all have to work together to figure out how do we build better educational resources. A lot of this is using the existing training mechanisms, existing workforce. How do we re-educate people? So it's a big initiative that we have to try to have everyone better understand cybersecurity. And then we talked a bit about international standards. I wanted to emphasize that everything we do at NIST is done through open mechanisms. And broader than that, U.S. policy is to turn to international standards for regulatory and procurement goals first. We have a partnership with the private sector and stakeholders in these international venues. Given that we expect with IoT and other applications there will be more needs for work in international standards bodies, we have developed these 4 priorities. And so we are increasingly doing work in the U.S. to better work and prioritize how we engage with these standards bodies to ensure we have robust standards that we can pull from to help organizations. So I'll leave it at that. I look forward to the discussion, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Mr. Sedgwick. We are talking a lot about defense, of course, about cyber defenses, and not much about offense, although they are strictly related. And although offenders, a lot of times, have some advantages over defenders, so how can we help defenders since they start from a difficult position? So maybe Shinichi Yokohama, head of cybersecurity integration and NTT Corporation, can talk about this.
Thank you for the introduction. NTT owns and runs the global IP backbone. And according to third-party analysis, we probably carry almost 1/3 of the global internet traffic. And that's counted by the number of the autonomous systems that our global backbone is connected. And because of such profile, we are often asked or expected to protect the clients and the governments. But unfortunately, we stand alone cannot protect the internet. And that's the motivation of why I am here. And also, NTT commits to contribute to the global cyber resiliency. But I have to honestly admit that NTT standalone cannot protect the internet. And that's why today I'd like to make proposals of some innovative activities which possibly brings in the game changing. As Carola said, today the attackers have a structural advantage over defenders. And as the Internet of Things spreads, the attack surface will increase exponentially. But the biggest reason why the attackers have a structural advantage, and actually it's the gap over defenders will increase, is that they collaborate. Attackers do collaborate, although invisibly. And we have to, devise new mechanisms where the defenders ourselves collaborate in a much more globally and scalably manner. And that's what I want to propose. So my proposal, 3 proposals as a game changers. The first one is the second point, which is the global information sharing. This is easily said, but very difficult to be done, obviously. I'll talk a little bit more detail with the next slides, but I think that should be driven by the industries rather than the governments. And the industry-driven global sharing and supported and endorsed by the multiple governments. That's what I mean by the global information sharing. The proposal number 2 is launching ethical hacker without borders. We have Doctors Without Borders in the healthcare space. And why can't we have similar mechanisms where the ethical hackers or white hackers collaborate internationally? And the third one is a little bit idealistic, and I'm not sure whether this is realistic, but can we run the G7 hackathon to bring the knowledge and the wisdom of the frontline operation to the policymakers? Those are the 3 my proposals. Now on the first one, the global information sharing. I think so-called ISACs exist in each country, and the maturity of the ISACs may be different by country. For example, in Japan, historically we had only 2 ISACs, one in financial service, the other in ICT. But starting this year, we had 2 new ISACs. One is automobile, and the other is electricities. And although the names are not ISACs, several other industries, such as chemical industries or trading companies, are having their own ISAC-like working groups. And moreover, the international connectivities between the ISACs are starting. For example, about 1 year ago, Japan Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communication, along with the Japan ICT ISAC, hosted a Europe, US, and Japan COM-ISAC or IT ISAC workshops in Japan. They agreed that the 3 regional collaboration would be helpful, and I think some follow-up activities are starting. Financial ISAC probably has much more advanced practice to do a global collaborations. And I believe that as we are having much more increased number of ISACs per industries and sectors, the foundation for such industry-driven collaborations through ISACs and using existing framework is now emerging. And I think it's now time that we stand up and authorizes the global ISAC collaboration as a new initiative of G7. The role and expectation to the government is twofold. One is to endorse such global sectoral collaboration, but more importantly, to provide a common platform. And when I say common platform, I mean two things. One is a technical platform where the automated information sharing is enabled. I know that in the States, I think it's Homeland Security runs the so-called automated indicator sharing system. And Japan government now has a plan to launch a similar system. And why don't we make them compatible so that the industry information sharing is much easier? And I think the similar initiative can be expanded into European communities. Such kind of technical platform is one. The other is a statutory framework. There are barriers to share the information across the borders. NTT, for example, runs and operates our global backbone over more than 100 countries. But the statutory requirement, for example, just simply put, the definition of the privacy information is different by country. In Japan, even the IP address is sometimes defined as privacy information, so we cannot share the IP address. And such kind of statutory and legal framework harmonization is also required to enable the global IP, information sharing. So with that support from the government, global information sharing could be enhanced. So that's my proposal number one. Number two and number three are on this slide. Once we have a global platform or G7 common platform, can we launch a Doctors Sans Frontières, like a cyber version of the Medicine Sans Frontières? We know that the talents are most scarce resource, and we nominate the white hackers from each of the G7 countries, and once any big outbreak, like WannaCry incident or future WannaCry-like incident outbreaks, we bring in those, hackers, ethical hackers with them, and work on them, collaborate. I think we do have similar mechanism already in place in the healthcare space, and it's a doable thing. The third proposal, the G7 hackathon, is connecting the frontline operational wisdom to the policymakers. I know my engineers at NTT is now still even working on the battle over the attackers day and night, 7/24. And the true wisdom and through the latest knowledge exists on the frontline operations. And with some means, we need to connect the difficulties and challenges and wisdoms from those frontline operations to the policymakers. I think those are the three proposals from my end. And in closing, in 3 years, 2020, Tokyo is hosting Olympic and Paralympic Games, and NTT needs to protect the Olympic and Paralympics. However, again, we cannot protect the Olympic Paralympic by ourselves, and we need a strong collaboration with the multiple stakeholders. And I do hope strong collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Yokohama. I think we understand that cybersecurity is not just a technical issue anymore. It affects everything. It can have consequences on almost every aspect of life. So does this awareness turn into more responsibility from companies? This is a question I would hand to Rocco Mammoliti, Chief Information Security Officer at Poste Italiane, which is also a banking company, so you are really on the front line from this respect of the cybersecurity.
Yes, of course. First of all, I want to thank the organizer for giving me the opportunity to participate in this discussion about crucial and current topics. Poste Italiane is one of the larger companies in Italy, delivers different type of services and products in different sectors, including banking, insurance, postal, logistics, e-commerce, and so on. That's why we need, as you said, a huge digital infrastructure. And the number and figures of Poste Italiane are very, very big, like a large company, with a nationwide branch network, major investments in technology, and more than 140,000 employees. Poste Italiane play a critical role in the process of growth in Italy, delivering also different digital services to more than 33 million customers, and with an annual revenue of about 18 billion euro. My privileged perspective in working on cybersecurity in Poste allows me to share some talks and consideration about a good governance in a company, in a large company, on cybersecurity. Digital ecosystem needs cybersecurity, but the term of cybersecurity usually refers to the protection of the ICT and communication system, technical system, and normally is used as a technical term with a narrow view of the matter. Nevertheless, cybersecurity is not solely the technical protection of ICT system. Rather, it is a responsibility also for a company due to the impact of cyber attacks on the business. Since cyberspace is also a complex structure of interconnected and interdependent components, this responsibility must be shared by all the stakeholders, as Professor said before, that deal with information and digital assets. In this way, it's possible to build a very trusted ecosystem where cyber threats are fought and mitigated simultaneously. Customer trust can grow, and as a consequence, cyberspace is able to support a healthy business development. There are at least 3 key aspects in protecting the customer. Customer of Poste Italiane likes any other company. Number 1, data privacy protection. 2, developing innovative and effective cybersecurity technical measures. This means providing secure products and services employing the state-of-the-art technology available, security by design approach, security monitoring, static and dynamic analysis, and so on. Number 3, all the actors, as I said before, must join forces to fight cybercrime and attacks. Let's make an example. And speaking about mobile application, we have to say that the number of users that access digital services through smartphone is steadily increasing. Companies from a wide range of sectors provide the customers with apps for smartphone on a wide range of topics like e-health, finance, e-government, logistics, smart home, automotive, and so on. The threat for sensitive personal data is evident. Vulnerabilities, and mainly technical vulnerabilities, may allow criminals to steal information from individuals' financial data and to steal enterprise business data or even defense or national business and national security data. When it comes to mobile apps, the security perimeters goes well beyond the organization boundaries. The security of the App Store, the mobile operating system, the web services the app relies on, all these components play a part in the overall security. In other words, the security of a normal, simple mobile app is never completely under the control of a single stakeholder or of a single company. Moreover, the same cyber threats affect different companies in different sectors. So it is evident how, as I said before, information sharing, cyber threat intelligence, and joint cyber response initiative must be put in place and protect the business arising from the mobile channel. In this sense, and in my opinion, cybersecurity is an actionable and shared responsibility. Let's make another example, and it's important in this case to mention the General Data Protection European Regulation, or GDPR. According to the GDPR, personal data should be processed and in a secure manner. Accountability means that adopted measures should be assessed, justified, documented, and demonstrated in case of controls. The burden of proof is up to the data controller, and appropriate security measures need to be implemented, taking into account the state of the art, the costs of implementation, the nature, the scope, context, and purpose of processing. Also, the risk of varying likelihood and severity for the rights and freedom of natural persons. When determining the feasibility of implementing GDPR in a normal company like Poste Italiane, a privacy by design approach is necessary, and data controllers should take into account the availability of appropriate technology, the nature of the personal data processing being carried out, the risks to individuals, and the cost of implementation. In fact, a lack of security could cost up to 4% of the annual worldwide turnover. So, the key point in the privacy matter is the GDPR requires a process for regular testing, assessing, and evaluating the effectiveness of technical and organizational security matters. When security measures are not enough, it may be useful to look also at cyber insurance. In this way, risk related to cyber threats can be created, also a business opportunity. The estimated cost of cyber attacks to business reached $450 billion during last year. Lloyd published a report with a case study where they estimated the cost of the disruption of cloud services could range from $4 to $50 billion. The same can happen in the case of the exploitation of a mass vulnerability software. In such scenario, part of the risk should be transferred to an insurance company. And this is why, according to the same report, the value of the cyber insurance market in 2017 is estimated to be worth over $3 billion. Last but not least, security and cybersecurity is naturally a cost to afford. From the business perspective, the economic sustainability of cybersecurity is crucial. In my experience, a valuable way to reduce costs is establishing and participating in public-private partnerships, or PPPs. The variety of partners and their value and expertise represents an outstanding chance to join all the capabilities and skills together in a coordinated action against cyber threats. In particular, university and research institutions bring their knowledge and contribution on the state-of-the-art security, which is the base for innovation. In return, they get a good opportunity for testing and validating results and for collecting new research challenges. Law enforcement bodies are another key actor within PPPs. Thanks to their capability to act effectively against cybercrime, to coordinate high-impact forces, and to operate in crisis scenarios. In return, they get easier access to digital means and infrastructure that are typically owned by large companies. In conclusion, it is clear that the ubiquity of digital services and mobile apps, as an example, required to secure the cyberspace for protecting, developing the business and the sharing and digital economy. A key aspect is the following. Privacy protection enables business customer profiling and increases their trust. And an important point is that cyber risk, as I said before, can be partly transferred to cyber insurance company. Although this is expected to be a promising market, the need of novel risk assessment models is an appealing challenge. Sustainability is the last key aspect that can be addressed by joining forces within PPPs among all the stakeholders and creating a single cybersecurity marketplace. So, my final note is that cybersecurity is too big to be managed by a single stakeholder. That's why it must be a common and shared responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mamoliti. So I think we are going to have a brief session of more questions and answers. Even I'm not sure about the time because our schedule shift. So I will start with the first question to all the panel, because information sharing is like a leitmotiv in cybersecurity, right? And also in this panel. But it's not something so easy. It's not something we can have it for granted, especially when there are national critical infrastructures, state interests, private companies, and privacy implication at stake. So my question is, how can we make it happen? What for? And how do you combine information sharing and the protection of data or other interests? Are there good examples of information or specific information sharing? Are there best practices to follow?
This is a difficult issue, and one of the examples of success in information sharing, or one type of example that's often successful, is when an informal network develops among practitioners in a particular field or a particular sector. Information is shared horizontally and often very frankly, but in a way that is protected by the trust relationships among the individual practitioners. We've had a lot of success where there is trust and where the assumption of reasonable and respectful treatment of data is enforced informally through a community. It has become more difficult when we try to legalize that process and establish fixed rules.
Well, as I tried to explain, there are basic requirements in the European law for information sharing, because we have observed through the years that indeed there's the need of self-discipline and self-organization, but the risk is to create, as I said in my speech, two swimming pools, and that's very dangerous. So there are basic obligations for information sharing with public authorities in case of a cyber accident that happens on critical infrastructure providers, and also a minimum of cooperation and information sharing when the accident happens cross-border in Europe. The other information sharing we require, although it's a lighter requirement, is when the accident happens with cloud provider, e-commerce providers, then there are minimal information sharing requirements on those providers. We have seen over and over, especially in the two last large-scale accidents, that lack of information is always an accelerator for spreading the accident or beyond, let's say, a limited community.
Anyone?
Yeah.
I just want to touch on that when people say information sharing, often people do not define what information they are talking about. And the information sharing itself should not be the objective. It's a tool and methodologies. And we have to first define why are you sharing the information? What is your objective? And there are probably three different objectives. The first one is for the situational awareness purpose. The second is to helping you make a decision purpose. And the third is for implementing the decisions. And depending on which objective you are thinking about, the required information should be different. So you have to first define why do you want to share the information, and among the players. That should be the first step.
Yeah, so I would agree with Shinichi that information sharing has a lot of different terminology, and often the objectives of information sharing have a bigger, but people talk about the need for information sharing and less about, well, what do organizations do once they receive that information? We talk often about how organizations need to have the capability to receive information, process it, and as appropriate, share it back out. You hear a lot about incidents that could have been prevented because a lot of the information was about a vulnerability that was that people were aware of. Right? People talk about zero-day attacks, but often some of these major breaches are due to vulnerabilities that have been out for months, if not in some cases years. In the U.S., it's been an interesting discussion on information sharing. For a while, private sector stakeholders had the concept that the government was sitting on a ton of great information, and if only they could declassify it quicker and get it out to the private sector, they could do a lot more to prevent these sorts of incidents from happening. But over the course of the last few years, the private sector began developing their own capabilities to better share information through things like ISACs and more informal ways of sharing information like what Ed was mentioning. And they began to learn that really they had most of the information already. And so we've really seen an interesting sea change in the U.S. where companies have developed their own mechanisms to share information and do it at a rate that's faster than they could if they were waiting for the government to provide it to them. And then the other innovation that we're looking to do that will be necessary as we move to an IoT environment is, and it's frightening to some, so we need to do it in the right way, but increasingly we're going to have to figure out ways to share this information in an automated fashion. So there is work going on to develop those standards, those technical standards. So if NTT finds a vulnerability and one of Ed's students finds a vulnerability, we can hold it up and compare it and understand that it's the same vulnerability or the same piece of information. So that sort of work is going on so that we can get to a place that when this information is shared, organizations can more quickly process it and take the steps that Shinichi was mentioning as a result.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay.
I had only a consideration about information sharing. Information sharing already is done in different organizations. ENISA made a lot of works in Europe and between different countries. But I think that it's very important that information sharing works only if the right information goes to the right person, the right people. So it's very important that at the technical level, CERT, Security Operations Center, and so on, from institution, from law enforcement, and from company, exchange information in a standard way and in a very, very easy and informal way.
And talking still about handling information, the European NIS directive contains reporting obligations to national authorities in case of a serious incident. I think it's a very important step, actually. But up to now, it seems to me the most difficult part. I mean, to be fast, responsive, and transparent when an organization gets, as a breach. This is not a European issue; it's a global one. Why is it so difficult, and how can organizations be helped in order to be more accountable in these situations?
So, based on the U.S. experience, it's difficult for us several reasons. One reason why it's proven to be difficult is understanding the right threshold. So, in the U.S., we don't have a national data breach law, and this is just for personal information. Information on breaches that didn't impact personal information, it really depends on the sector, and there are different laws. So, there's no unified breach notification law, and there's no unified breach information law for personal information. That's done by 47 different state laws. So there's been a call for greater consistency among those laws, but you also have to think carefully about the impact of the notification and how you define what should be notified and at what point. So it's reasonable to suggest that you wouldn't want to report after you've done a thorough investigation to determine the nature of the breach. The problem is that's reasonable as a discussion point, but then some organizations will have those investigations drag on for 2 or 3 years before they report. But on the other hand, you can understand why it's important to do it in such a way that you're not giving the consumer false information because your immediate investigation didn't reveal enough. And we've seen that in the U.S. too, where an organization has to report once, and they report a second time, and then they report a third time. And that doesn't really do the consumer much benefit. Another challenge is also there's sort of breach notification fatigue. And so in the U.S., you can actually hire lawyers to help you write the notification letter that they have proven will minimize the likelihood that an organization would take the service that you're providing as a result of the breach. So figuring out ways to do this effectively so that the consumer understands what has been lost and the steps they have to take to minimize the damage is definitely an ongoing discussion, and I think consumers are perceiving it differently. But I will say, at least in the U.S., a lot of consumers at this point, they don't respond very well to a breach because in many ways it'll be the third or fourth time that they've lost their personal information.
So the situation in Europe is that there are 3 different data breach notification systems. One that you just quoted is the NIS system. Then we have the notification for privacy incidents, so in case the data which have been breached are personal data. And then we have a notification system for electronic payment under the Electronic Payment Directive. Now, indeed, that's the risk that the whole exercise becomes a sort of a gigantic bureaucratic exercise. And that risk we try, of course, as much as we can to minimize. At the same time, over and over, we have seen that for many different reasons, companies' reputation, the internal assessment that sometimes is complicated, companies tend to be rather stingy, so to say, in terms of willingness to share when an accident happens. Now, of course, in other sectors of our society, we don't accept this to happen. Take epidemics. I mean, it's common sense that information about epidemics is shared. It's less common sense when it comes to cyber. To me, the sociology of it, the economics of it, is not that different. I mean, the reason why our society has developed a culture about sharing information about epidemics is because this creates a positive externality. This is proven over and over. I'm personally convinced the same is in cybersecurity. So there's a definite plus in sharing. Of course, I have to say that all the systems that also exist in Europe of informal sharing, of the computer emergency response teams, of the experts, of the academics are equally effective and sometimes even faster. But at the same time, in the two most significant accidents we had in the last 6 months, the information was propagated in a very slow manner. And we have evidence that if information would have given much more early, we would have limited the spreading of the infection. So it's a difficult balance. And I said it 3 times, I said it for the 4th time, we don't want to turn it into a bureaucratic exercise, but I'm convinced that there's a positive externality in the exercise of information sharing.
Thank you. If there are no other... to add something? Yeah, just quickly, because...
Yes. I'd like to add a bit to what Adam said. Although I agree with what he said, I think I am more optimistic about in my interpretation of the experience in the U.S. Because I believe that the data breach notification requirements that we have done a lot to trigger many of the social oversight mechanisms, such as attention from the press and legislatures, and also have reduced the externality that companies face. The fact that a company must notify their customers in a very public way has created a strong disincentive to have a breach, a stronger disincentive than we had before.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have to close the debate. Thank you to everyone for being here.